So this is your first set of classification notes. At this point you should have already participated in the shoe classification lab activity. So now we're going to go through and break down the meaning of what classification actually is and apply it scientifically instead of with shoes. So classification is the grouping of organisms or categorizing based on similarities. So yesterday you used details about your shoes in order to go through and classify them. So what color were they? What size were they? Were they male or female shoes? Those are all details which are used for the similarities in order to determine how something can be classified. So you can think about the classification or the classified ads in a newspaper. You can also think about everyone's favorite site, Craigslist. Craigslist has a wide variety of objects online that are categorized by their similarities. So one category could be the for sale section. Within the for sale section you will find clothes, cars, jewelry that are for sale. So even breaking that down a little further, whether it's new or used, are all similarities that can be used in order to determine what you're going to be looking for. Taxonomy is the branch of biology concerned with grouping or naming of organisms. Someone, or a scientist specifically, who studies taxonomy is called a taxonomist. So as you're learning to name scientifically the organisms within biology, that's the study of taxonomy, whereas you will become the taxonomist because you are studying taxonomy. So now we're going to go into some history of classification, starting with Aristotle. Aristotle is a Greek philosopher. He was the first to develop a system of naming. So his system was very basic. It included two groups, which were animals and plants. So from there, this individual called Carolus Linnaeus was able to come up with his own naming system that we still use today. So Carolus Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist that proposed a modern system of naming. So a botanist is an individual or a scientist who studies plants. The name of Carolus Linnaeus' system was called binomial nomenclature, which is a two-part naming system. Bi means two. Nomenclature refers to naming system. So his naming system had categories which we call taxa. So the taxa used for that are the genus, which is a group of closely related species. They're written with uppercase letters. An example of that would be Homo. So this is the first time we've heard this bit of the information, but the second taxa, which is species, is a detailed description of organisms written with a lowercase letter. So we've talked about species when we are in ecology and we talked about your levels of organization. So the example of a species would be sapiens. There are some specific steps when using binomial nomenclature. So the steps for writing scientific names include A, write the genus first and then the species second. The genus should be in uppercase letters. The species should be in lowercase letters. So together they must be written in italics or underlined. So because very few of us write in italics, we're going to be underlining to show our scientific names. So here you have Homo sapien and it's underlined instead of written in italics. So what's the purpose of classification? Well, classification allows scientists to have an orderly method when naming organisms. You know that everyone around the world does not speak the same language, but using classification and more specifically binomial nomenclature, scientists are able to name an organism, study an organism, or just have general conversation about an organism and call it the same thing. And everyone would call it the same thing. So all around the world, everyone calls a Homo sapien the same thing, so everyone knows what a Homo sapien is. So classification provides a framework for logic and order so relationships among living organisms can be seen easily. So to give you a modern example of what I'm referring to, if you think about the sport of football, in America, what we know for a football to be is this funny shape right here, whereas when you go into other countries, a football looks more like this, which in our country is what we call soccer. So a football versus a football. So you have to be careful when you're speaking and using terminology, because what it means in one country or one language is not necessarily what it means in another. Whereas when we go back to Homo sapien is going to be the same thing everywhere. So organisms are grouped into 7 taxa, and remember, taxa are just categories that have characteristics or similarities. So the first one is kingdom. After kingdom you have phylum, and phylum is the second taxa for animals. If you're referring to plants, then you should have a division. The third is class. The fourth is order. The fifth is family. The sixth is genus, and the seventh is species. So notice with binomial nomenclature, it only uses the last 2 taxa in order to formally name an object or organism. So genus and species are those 2. Remember the example that we've been using. Genus would be Homo, species would be sapien. So we can actually use the kingdom, phylum, class, order, or family to continually or continuously name a Homo sapien, which is just a human being. So remember, we're going to use the phylum because a human is a type of animal if you go back to your cells. So an analogy that you can use to help you remember this better in the future is kicking ponies can only fart going slowly. So kingdom is the kicking, phylum is the ponies, class is can, order is only, family fart, going is your genus, and slowly is your species. So I challenge you, if you don't like this analogy, come up with your own. And you may even want to include division because this analogy does not. So going back to those characteristics that we've talked about, there's more than one way to show those similarities of an organism. So here we're using the main 3 types. The first one is structure. Structure is the physiological connections between organisms that have a common ancestor. So if you think back to evolution, some of the structures we referred to, we deemed them as comparative anatomy. So within your comparative anatomy, it was either going to be a homologous structure or a vestigial structure that you're going to use to show the common ancestor or to show how one organism relates to another. Chemistry are organisms that have a common ancestor which will have a similar DNA sequence. So if you think back to the second evidence of evolution, which was biochemistry or biochemical analysis, that was using the similarities in the DNA sequence, the amino acid sequence, and the protein sequence in order to determine if something was related or not. The third is behavior, and your behavior is how organisms came to exist according to their interactions. So if you think back to ecology, there are many ways that animals interact with themselves and their environment. That's what the study of ecology shows. So if you think about some of the symbiotic relationships, maybe we can describe how one organism benefits another, and that's going to allow them to adapt to their environment, which is your natural selection, and how organisms will eventually survive and go on to reproduce. So some of these behaviors are going to help us determine how another organism is going to be related to the first organism or their common ancestor. So last, what you're going to do is learn the 6 kingdoms. So if you go back to our analogy, starting from the beginning of kicking was kingdoms. So you have 6 kingdoms in order to classify organisms. So the first one is archaic bacteria. Archaic actually refers to extreme or old. So with archaic bacteria, they have lived a long time ago. In addition to living a long time ago, they live in extreme environments. You have eubacteria. If you think back to when we talked about cells and the different types of cells, we talked about eukaryotes. And eukaryotes are the organisms that have a nucleus, but in this case we're just referring to the U part, which means true. So this is true bacteria. Protists, fungi, plant, and animal. So if you go back to reflecting on cells, plants and animals and protists are all eukaryotic cells, and then fungi, and in this case eubacteria, would be your prokaryotes. So now what we want you to do is try some on your own for H. So good luck.